Chapter 5 of The Fastest Boy in the World. I'd been excited at the thought of the pastry shop. There's no such thing in Cademy, but I knew about sweet cakes because Marco's uncle had brought some when he'd come to visit his family. Marco said he'd never eaten anything like those cakes in his whole life. He said they stuck to his teeth, but in a nice way. I wasn't silly enough to expect Grandfather to buy me one, of course, but I suppose there was lurking hope at the back of my mind. As it was, I didn't even have time to take a proper look through the door. All I got was a glimpse of a shiny floor, some metal chairs and tables, and a glass counter with piles of yellow, brown and white cakes on shelves underneath. It wasn't the Happiness pastry shop that Grandfather wanted to visit after all, but the building beside it. This was high, with shops on the ground floor and 4 stories above. Grandfather pushed open a door at the side and began to walk slowly up the staircase. When the door clanged shut behind us, I'll admit right now that my nerves were tingling. I'd never been in a place like this before. As a matter of fact, I wasn't exactly used to stairs. In Cademy, even our school is all on one floor. I followed Grandfather up step by step, going as slowly as he did. On every landing there were doors off to the left and the right, and Grandfather stopped, gasping for breath, pointing to the plaques on them to make me read them out to him. They were all in English, and he's better at reading Amharic. Blue Nile Insurance, I spelled out. Gion Export, Lion Trading. Every time Grandfather shook his head and sighed, and plodded on upwards. At last we came to a door that just said Ethiopian Sports Company, and I'd read it to him, and when I'd read it out to him, Grandfather gave a grunt of triumph that turned into a cough. I can tell you, if you're interested, that we'd climbed 69 steps. I looked round and saw that he was holding on to the banister, and his face had that grey look on it again. There was nothing I could do, so I just waited until he had stopped panting. "Is this it, Grandfather? Are you all right?" He didn't answer, but he reached out for my shoulder and, leaning on me, walked the few steps to the door. It opened just before we reached it, and a smart young woman in a red dress came rushing out, a handbag swinging from her shoulder. She clattered off down the stairs in her high-heeled shoes. Even though she'd barely glanced at me, she'd made me feel like a worm. I was horribly conscious of my bare feet and crumpled shirt and stained old shorts. I think that, just for once, Grandfather must have guessed how I was feeling, because he squeezed my elbow and said, "City girls, Solomon? They all think they're the Queen of Sheba." Then he squared his shoulders and marched me into the office. It took a while for him to explain himself, and we had to put up with quite a few stares and raised eyebrows from the 5 people sitting behind desks who were reading piles of paper, or clattering away on keyboards, or staring into screens, or talking on telephones. It was then that I heard Atto Almue's name for the first time. At last, though, they waved us towards a bench at the side of the room. I still hadn't got any idea of what Grandfather wanted, or why we'd come to this place, and as we sat and waited, on and on, I started to wonder if Grandfather had any idea either. Old people did get mixed up with things sometimes, I knew. Perhaps we'd come all this way to Addis for some crazy reason after all. I should have had more faith in my wily old Grandfather, because at last a door at the end of the room opened and a man came out. He looked at us without smiling. He seemed a bit cautious, as if he was afraid we'd turn out to be a nuisance. He was about the same age as Abba and Cousin Wandu. I know that now, but he looked much younger and he couldn't have been more different. He was wearing a brilliant white shirt and a blue tie, and his shoes were shiny with polish. His hands were smooth, not a bit like Abba's powerful, rough working hands, and he had a big gold ring on one finger. I could see a silver-coloured watch too, poking out from beneath his shirt sleeve. "So you're Atto Demisi, are you?" he said, frowning. He looked down at me. "Did this boy bring you here? You can go now, son," and he started feeling his pocket for a coin. Grandfather was still struggling to get up from the bench, and the effort was making him mutter irritably. "This is my grandson Solomon," he wheezed out. "Are you really Alamu, Petro's son?" The man frowned deeply. He nodded curtly. "You'd better come into my office." He led us across the room, with the eyes of all of the people behind their desks following us curiously, and in through the doors of his office, which he closed behind us.